give everything you got to every at-bat, every pitch, concentrate like crazy.
It's a great feeling. It's a great feeling to have when you're down in a ball game, to feel like 5 games in a row you've overcome the lead. It's a real feeling of confidence.
First of all, it's a language barrier, and because of that, I think he can't be a guy that would sort of sit in a circle with 4 or 5 American players and talk about the game.
Mike Schmidt once said that a player's style would make him hate that guy as an opponent. Those were not the words of a bitter old man. Those were the words of a legend who spent his whole career carrying grudges, getting into brawls, and clashing with some of the biggest names in baseball. Today, we are talking about 9 players Mike Schmidt absolutely could not stand. I hate his guts. That is what this story is really about. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Mike Schmidt is one of the greatest third basemen who ever lived. 3 MVP awards, 10 Gold Gloves, a World Series ring, an 18-year career spent entirely in Philadelphia. He did things on a baseball field that almost nobody else ever has. But Schmidt was quiet. He was analytical. He was deeply sensitive to criticism in an era when baseball rewarded toughness, volume, and raw intimidation above almost everything else. He played his best baseball inside his own head, processing the pressure privately and converting it into performance. That combination, great player, internal processor, high sensitivity, did not always coexist peacefully with the culture of the sport around him. The era Schmidt played in was loud, physical, aggressive. Veterans held young players down to establish the pecking order. Pitchers threw at batters without a second thought and expected no apology. Brawls were common, and sometimes celebrated as proof of a team's toughness. Coaches screamed across clubhouses. Hustle was not just expected, it was treated as the core measure of a man's character. And Schmidt, analytical and reserved, often looked wrong to the people around him, even when he was performing at an elite level and producing results nobody could argue with. Before we get into the list, if you are watching this on YouTube, hit that hype button right now. The hype feature lets you show love for videos you think deserve more attention. If Schmidt's story is worth your time, take 2 seconds and give this video some hype. It means a lot and it helps the channel grow. Now, the most recent controversy on this list is where we open. Because it happened decades after Schmidt retired, and it still blew up in his face in a major way. Then we go back in time. We go through 9 names, 9 feuds. Some were silent rivalries fought entirely through statistics. Some turned physical and left real damage behind. Some nearly ended entire seasons. Here's the order, counting down from 9 to 1. We start with number 9 and work our way up to number 1. Let us go. Number 9, George Foster. Some rivalries are loud. Fights, arguments, trash talk in the press, statements that make headlines the next morning. Then there is the kind that simmers quietly for years, never boiling over in public, but burning hot just the same. That is exactly what Mike Schmidt had with George Foster. This was not a feud anyone heard about in real time. There were no confrontations on the field, no war of words in the papers. It was a cold war fought through box scores and award votes and the slow accumulation of seasons, and Foster won more rounds than Schmidt would have liked. George Foster played for the Cincinnati Reds during one of the most dominant runs in baseball history, the Big Red Machine. Cincinnati in the mid to late 1970s was an offensive powerhouse. A team that seemed to generate stars at every position. Foster was right at the center of it. He led the National League in home runs twice, and in runs batted in 3 times, during a stretch that directly overlapped with Schmidt's rise to prominence. He was a feared, elite hitter who competed with Schmidt for the biggest individual prizes the sport had to offer. The rivalry reached its most intense point in 1977. Schmidt hit 38 home runs that year. In almost any other season, that kind of production would have put a hitter in serious MVP consideration, and probably at the top of the ballot. Not in 1977, because George Foster had one of the greatest offensive seasons in the history of the National League that year. Foster hit 52 home runs and drove in 149 runs. He won the NL MVP award in a runaway. Schmidt finished well behind him in the voting, despite his own genuinely excellent numbers. There was nothing Schmidt could do about it. Foster was simply operating on a different level that season, and the award reflected that reality completely. What made this rivalry particularly frustrating was not any one season. It was the sustained proximity over multiple years. Both men were right-handed power hitters in the same league, competing for the same prizes year after year. From 1976 to 1981, their peak numbers were remarkably close. Foster hit 198 home runs during that stretch. Schmidt hit 221. Foster drove in 671 runs. Schmidt drove in 612. Foster batted .296. Schmidt batted .271. Foster slugged .546. Schmidt slugged .556. The gap between them was genuinely narrow. Every season felt like a direct competition, and the margins were close enough that a single hot month could flip an award result in either direction. Schmidt never publicly expressed resentment toward Foster. That was not in his character. Schmidt was not someone who aired his private frustrations in the press. But the research is direct, that a silent, competitive resentment existed between these two men over that period. They were constantly in each other's way. Every time Foster won an award or led a major offensive category, it was a concrete reminder that Schmidt had a rival operating at nearly the same ceiling. For a player as internally driven and sensitive as Schmidt, that kind of sustained competition does not leave you without feelings. It just leaves you without a place to put them publicly. Foster was not the guy who hit Schmidt with a pitch or insulted him in the clubhouse. He was the guy who kept taking what Schmidt was reaching for. Sometimes the most lasting friction comes not from someone who despises you, but from someone who is just as good as you and knows it. That is number 9, and it sets the tone for everything that follows on this list. Number 8, Dave Kingman. If George Foster was the rival Schmidt respected, but quietly resented, Dave Kingman was the one Schmidt privately could not stand for entirely different reasons. This was not about competing for the same awards or chasing the same ceiling. This was about a fundamental philosophical disagreement over what baseball was supposed to look like, what a baseball player was supposed to value, and what the game deserved from the people who played it professionally. Dave Kingman was enormous, 6 feet 6 inches tall, with raw power that was genuinely awe-inspiring to watch in person. He led the National League in home runs twice in his career and hit tape measure blasts that people talked about for years after they left the yard. When he made contact, the ball went an extraordinary distance. On those occasions, he could look like one of the most dangerous hitters in the entire sport. The problem, in Schmidt's view, was everything else. Kingman struck out at historic rates. His batting averages were poor throughout his career, finishing at .236 for his time in the majors. His on-base percentage was one of the lowest for any regular player in his era. His defense was widely regarded as atrocious by players and analysts alike. He played for 7 different teams over the course of his career because organizations kept growing tired of what he cost them in exchange for what he gave back. One description of Kingman from that era said he had the personality of a tree stump. People around him generally did not enjoy the experience of being his teammate. Schmidt was the opposite in almost every way that mattered beyond the home run column. Yes, Schmidt hit for massive power. He hit 38 home runs in 1977, the same year he lost the MVP. He finished his career with 548 home runs. But he also won 10 Gold Gloves. He worked deliberately and consistently throughout his career to reduce his strikeout rate. He built his on-base percentage into something respectable. He made himself into a complete player, someone who contributed in every phase of the game. He spent 18 years with one organization because he was worth keeping through both his peaks and his more difficult stretches. To a player who put that kind of effort into being a total ball player, watching someone like Kingman get celebrated purely for raw power felt like a genuine insult to the craft. All or nothing was not Schmidt's idea of baseball. It was, in his private view, a party trick performed at the expense of everything the game actually demanded. Kingman's approach treated defense and plate discipline and team chemistry as optional extras. Schmidt had spent his entire career proving they were not optional. They were the point. What made it worse was that Kingman could occasionally look just as good as Schmidt in a single box score. The most famous example came on May 17, 1979, at Wrigley Field. Kingman hit 3 home runs that afternoon and drove in 6 runs for the Cubs. For one afternoon, his numbers looked dominant. But Schmidt refused to be outshone. He hit 2 home runs of his own, including the game winner in the 10th inning, and the Phillies won an extraordinary 23-22 game. Schmidt delivered in the moment that mattered most. That was the distinction, at least in Schmidt's mind. The private contempt was real and well documented. That earns number 8 its place on this list. Number 7, Joaquin Andujar. Stepping back into the early 1980s, we come to a pitcher who irritated Mike Schmidt in a way that was both tactical and deeply personal. Joaquin Andujar pitched for the St. Louis Cardinals during the intense National League East pennant races of that decade, when the Cardinals and Phillies were regularly fighting for the division title, and neither team had much patience for the other. He was a talented pitcher who produced real results.
He was also temperamental, eccentric, theatrical,
and wildly aggressive on the mound in ways that Schmidt found objectionable at a fundamental level. Andujar had been acquired by the Cardinals from the Houston Astros during the strike-shortened 1981 season. His career had been inconsistent before that, but under the guidance of pitching coach Hub Kittle, who served as a steady father figure to the volatile Dominican pitcher, Andujar found a level of consistency he had not previously maintained. In 1982, he compiled 15 wins and a 2.47 ERA. He later put together a 20-win season as well. When he was locked in and performing at his ceiling, he was one of the most difficult starters in the entire National League to face. But the way Andujar pitched was the source of Schmidt's problem with him. He leaned heavily on high, tight, brushback pitches, using them not just as an occasional strategy, but as a constant, aggressive tool of intimidation. He wanted hitters uncomfortable. He wanted them flinching. He combined this aggressive pitching approach with theatrical posturing and wild mound antics that went well beyond the ordinary. Schmidt watched all of this and openly loathed it. He did not see it as competitive intensity. He saw it as a safety threat wrapped in performance art, a reckless style that endangered batters and showed contempt for the basic responsibilities a pitcher carried every time he took the mound. The friction between them reached a visible peak during a critical series in September 1982. On September 14th, with the bases loaded in the 8th inning of a tight game, Cardinals reliever Bruce Sutter induced an inning-ending double play from Schmidt. It preserved a St. Louis victory. The very next day, September 15th, Andujar threw a 3-hit shutout against Philadelphia, pushing St. Louis into first place in the National League East for good. 2 consecutive gut-punch games in a critical stretch of the pennant race. The irritation did not stop there. Andujar's dominance and theatrical style continued to bother Schmidt through the mid-1980s, across multiple seasons. Every time that brushback-heavy, posturing pitcher took the mound against the Phillies, Schmidt had to face someone whose entire approach he found both dangerous and disrespectful. Number 7 is secure on this list. Number 6, Tug McGraw. Now we shift from opponents across the diamond to someone who wore the same uniform. Tug McGraw was a teammate of Mike Schmidt for several years in Philadelphia. He was the closer who delivered some of the most celebrated moments in Phillies history, including getting the final out of the 1980 World Series and delivering Philadelphia its first championship in nearly a century. He was beloved by fans throughout the city. He was the kind of player who fed on electricity, who thrived on pressure and chaos in the pure adrenaline of a 9th inning with everything on the line. And he gave Mike Schmidt a consistent headache throughout those years. The problem was not personal dislike in any simple sense. It was a fundamental clash in how these two men understood what good baseball looked like and what good preparation required. Schmidt was cerebral and controlled above all else. He worked deliberately to eliminate emotional swings from his performance. He experimented with transcendental meditation to help himself maintain a flat, focused mental state during games, particularly during the years when he was being regularly booed at Veterans Stadium, and the external noise threatened to get inside his head. For Schmidt, controlling emotion was not weakness or coldness. It was discipline. It was the only rational approach to sustaining excellence across a 162-game season year after year. McGraw operated in a completely different world. His identity was built on emotion, unpredictability, and chaos turned into momentum. His legendary You Gotta Believe campaign with the 1973 New York Mets had become part of baseball folklore, a rallying cry that embodied his entire personality. He pitched with visible passion every single time he stepped on the mound. When it worked, it was electric and memorable. When it did not work, the results were costly and concrete. For a player like Schmidt, who valued systematic preparation and emotional control above almost everything else, watching McGraw operate from a place of pure reactive instinct was deeply uncomfortable. The moment that most clearly defined their philosophical divide came during the July 1977 series against Pittsburgh, which we will fully detail when we reach number 2. After Schmidt was hurt and removed from the game, McGraw was still in the bullpen. 1 inning after Schmidt was injured, McGraw intentionally threw a retaliatory pitch that struck Pittsburgh's Willie Stargell. McGraw was immediately ejected. The Phillies lost the game in extra innings. From Schmidt's perspective, that ejection was not loyalty. It was a reckless, emotion-driven decision that cost the team their most important reliever at a critical moment. McGraw felt the moment and acted on it without calculating the cost. Schmidt calculated everything. That gap never closed. Number 5, Pete Rose. This one carries more layers than almost any other name on this list. Pete Rose arrived in Philadelphia in 1979, and his effect on the Phillies was real and significant. His relentless, maximum effort style helped push a talented but chronically underachieving team over the final threshold. The Phillies won the World Series in 1980. Rose was a meaningful part of that run. Schmidt himself acknowledged as much. But Rose also came to Philadelphia, looked at the franchise player, and told him in plain terms that he had been doing things the wrong way. Rose earned the nickname Charlie Hustle from Whitey Ford during a 1963 spring training game after sprinting to first base on a routine walk. That hustle was not something Rose performed on occasion. It was his complete identity. He played harder than almost anyone else in the history of the game, in every situation, regardless of the score or the inning. When Rose arrived in Philadelphia and looked at Schmidt, he did not see a kindred spirit. He saw someone whose approach he found fundamentally lacking. Rose famously described Schmidt's pre-1979 demeanor as pathetic. He claimed Schmidt did not have real hustle before Rose arrived and changed the culture of the clubhouse. That was not a subtle or private criticism. That was a direct, public indictment of the franchise player. The philosophical clash was real. Schmidt led by example through technical execution and internal focus. He was not a screamer. He processed pressure quietly and stayed emotionally neutral, because that neutrality was what allowed him to perform consistently over long stretches. Rose was confrontational, relentless, and built intensity through sheer force of will. Those two philosophies were never going to coexist without friction. Despite the tension and the public insults, Schmidt campaigned for Rose during his own 1995 Hall of Fame induction speech. That was a generous act towards someone who had called him pathetic. But Schmidt's position on Rose shifted in later years. He acknowledged that persistent post-retirement controversies made the character clause increasingly difficult to navigate. Rose passed away at 83 in October 2024. Commissioner Manfred posthumously removed Rose from the permanently ineligible list on May 13, 2025, sparking intense debate about legacy and standards. Schmidt had complicated feelings about his old teammate, right up until the very end. The grudge never fully dissolved. Number 4. Larry Bowa. If the Rose situation was layered, the Larry Bowa situation was something more raw and sustained. Bowa was Schmidt's own teammate, the shortstop who played right beside him on the left side of the Philadelphia infield for years. Together, they formed one of the best defensive tandems in baseball during that era. Statistically, they were excellent together. Personally, they nearly destroyed each other more than once and required physical intervention to prevent serious harm. The friction started from the beginning. When the organization pushed Schmidt to the major leagues, based on their belief in his potential, Bowa took it personally. He was a fierce, self-made player who had earned everything through relentless work. Watching a young player get fast-tracked felt deeply unfair. He viewed Schmidt as spoiled and cocky, and he made no real effort to hide that judgment. Rather than offering any kind of veteran guidance during Schmidt's genuine early struggles, Bowa needled him constantly. He criticized Schmidt's offensive numbers in front of teammates. He poked at the .196 batting average from the 1973 rookie season. He found ways to dig and probe rather than help develop. For a young player who was already deeply self-critical, that kind of sustained clubhouse harassment from a veteran is genuinely corrosive. The tension eventually reached a breaking point in the visiting clubhouse in Houston. Schmidt later admitted that he almost wanted to kill Bowa during that confrontation. 4 teammates had to physically separate them to prevent the situation from becoming something much worse. The managerial transition from Danny Ozark to Dallas Green in late 1979 did not ease anything. Green was a loud, confrontational manager who regularly screamed at the team about players trying to be too cool, a direct shot at Schmidt's reserved intellectual approach. Bowa thrived under that energy. Schmidt felt targeted. The division between the two infielders deepened over time. They went on to win a World Series together. They also had a confrontation that required 4 people to stop. That duality is number 4. Number 3, Bob Gibson. Going further back now to the very start of Mike Schmidt's major league existence. When Schmidt arrived in the big leagues in 1972 and began his full rookie season in 1973, Bob Gibson was still one of the most intimidating presences in National League Baseball. Gibson was the Cardinals' enforcer in every sense, a pitcher who had built his entire legacy on dominance, psychological warfare, and the ruthless unwillingness to give anything to any opposing hitter ever under any circumstances. Schmidt in those years was exactly the kind of young player Gibson targeted. He was new. He had not proven anything. He had not earned anything yet. His batting average in 1973 was .196. In his first 40 Major League plate appearances, he struck out 15 times. He was raw, and everyone watching could see it. Gibson saw it too, and his response was to make every single at-bat a test of mental endurance. Gibson used high, tight fastballs to attack Schmidt consistently across those early encounters. This was not primarily about the mechanics of getting a hitter out. This was about psychological warfare. The systematic effort to make a young hitter understand that he was not yet entitled to be comfortable at this level. Schmidt later described Gibson as a deeply feared and disliked opponent who gave absolutely no quarter to anyone, especially not to players who had not yet proven they belonged at the major league level. The relationship was one-sided for a while, but then something shifted on April 22, 1973, during the second game of a doubleheader. Schmidt came to the plate in the bottom of the ninth inning with 2 outs and the game tied 1-1. He was struggling, deeply. The pressure was real, and he hit a walk-off solo home run off Gibson to win the game. Schmidt described this as the most excited he had ever been in his baseball career. It was a psychological breakthrough against the specific pitcher who had been most systematically trying to break him down. But Gibson kept asserting himself, even as his career wound down. On July 27, 1975, in a relief appearance that ended up being career victory number 251, Gibson came into a game against the Phillies and pitched 4 shutout innings. He struck out both Larry Bowa and Mike Schmidt in the same inning. Even near the end, Gibson was making sure certain players understood who he was. Schmidt learned hard lessons from Gibson. He learned them through repeated exposure to someone who gave nothing and respected nothing until it was absolutely earned through performance. The education was brutal and permanent. Number 2, Bruce Kyson. We have arrived at the feud that left the most concrete and measurable damage behind. Not just bad feelings or philosophical friction or a cold statistical rivalry. This one broke a bone. This one changed a season. This one may have directly changed the outcome of a championship series. Bruce Kyson pitched for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Phillies and Pirates rivalry of the late 1970s was built on a foundation of mutual hostility, physical intimidation, and the kind of aggression that regularly crossed lines most teams observed without comment. The tension in that July 1977 series between the two teams began before the most famous incident happened. Pitching in the early part of the series, Pirates starter Bert Blyleven threw a pitch directly under Schmidt's chin during the first inning. He followed it with a tight ball to Greg Luzinski. By the third inning, Blyleven threw another high pitch at Schmidt, who turned and pointed directly at the mound. Both benches emptied and the two teams faced off in a standoff, but nothing physical erupted yet. Everything broke open in the 7th inning of the July 8th game. Phillies outfielder Gary Maddox had just hit a tie-breaking 3-run home run off Kyson, giving Philadelphia a 6-3 lead. The Phillies were in control. Kyson retired Larry Bowa on a groundout. Then, deliberately and without ambiguity, Kyson threw an inside pitch that struck Schmidt squarely in the back. Schmidt walked toward first base and said, "Next time, I am coming out there." Kyson replied, "Why wait?" Schmidt charged the mound immediately. He threw punches. Both benches emptied completely. During the chaos, Pirates catcher Ed Ott, a former amateur wrestler, grabbed Schmidt. Phillies outfielder Greg Luzinski subdued Kyson. The brawl was extended and costly. The physical cost to Schmidt was severe. He fractured and dislocated the ring finger of his right hand. He could not return until July 12th. Before the injury, he had already hit 25 home runs. After returning with compromised mechanics from a damaged hand, he hit just 13 more home runs over the entire remainder of the regular season. The lingering effect followed him all the way to October. When the Phillies made the National League Championship Series in 1977, Schmidt batted .063. He was essentially unable to contribute offensively in the most important series of the year. The research connects this directly to the physical damage from the Kyson brawl. The grudge had a measurable cost. A broken finger from a mound charge changed a postseason. That is why Bruce Kyson sits at number 2. Number 1, Odubel Herrera. And now we arrive at the top of this list. Not the most violent incident, not the one that fractured a bone, not the one that ended a playoff run, but the one that was most revealing about who Mike Schmidt truly was beneath the surface of his greatness, and the one that showed most clearly what happens when a legend's standards and blind spots collide with a changing world he no longer fully recognized. On June 6, 2017, Schmidt was decades removed from his playing career. He was serving as a guest color commentator and analyst for the Phillies and appeared on Philadelphia's Sports Radio 94 WIP morning show. The subject was Odubel Herrera, the young Venezuelan center fielder who had become one of the centerpieces of the Phillies' rebuilding process. In 2016, Herrera had been genuinely excellent. He posted a .286 batting average, hit 15 home runs, stole 25 bases, and accumulated a team-high 4.3 WAR. He was 24 years old, dynamic, and one of the most interesting players in the organization. The host asked Schmidt whether the Phillies could realistically build a championship-caliber team around Herrera. Schmidt answered no. And the reason he gave was the language barrier. He argued that Herrera could not serve as the kind of cornerstone leader a winning franchise required because he was unable to sit in a circle with 4 or 5 American players and have a substantive conversation about the game. He could not confront a teammate about their effort or demand accountability from someone who was falling short. The language gap, in Schmidt's reasoning, made the kind of leadership a true cornerstone player needed effectively impossible for Herrera to provide. He also directed criticism at Herrera's style of play on the field. The bat flips, the visible exuberance, the kind of expressive, celebratory behavior that had become more common in the modern game. Schmidt said that Herrera's antics would have made him hate Herrera as an opponent. That word, hate, directed at a current Phillies player by one of the franchise's all-time legends, landed with significant force. The immediate backlash from media and public voices was severe and widespread. Critics called the comments culturally insensitive and dismissive of the contributions and capabilities of Latin American players at every level of the sport. They raised names like Roberto Clemente, who did not speak fluent English and became one of the most beloved and respected players in baseball history. Albert Pujols, Miguel Cabrera, players who did not arrive in the United States speaking English and who still managed to lead clubhouses, anchor franchises, and win championships at the highest level. The historical record directly contradicted Schmidt's premise about language and leadership. Inside the Phillies' own organization, the response was notable. Venezuelan shortstop Freddie Galvis publicly defended Schmidt, saying the comments had been taken out of context and that Schmidt had been a consistently supportive figure during their 8-year acquaintance. Others in the clubhouse pointed to Carlos Ruiz, one of the most respected leaders in recent Phillies history, who had relied on interpreters during the early years of his career and had never been anything other than a genuine clubhouse leader throughout. Schmidt recognized the damage quickly. He issued a direct, personal apology to Herrera and to Latin American players generally on the same afternoon. Herrera accepted the apology with measured dignity. He disagreed with the original premise, but respected Schmidt's legacy in the game. That was a gracious response from someone who had been publicly undervalued by a franchise icon. This incident sits at number 1, not because it was Schmidt's worst moment as a competitor or the most physically consequential feud of his career. It holds the top position because of what it revealed. Schmidt spent his entire career developing precise, exacting standards for what a baseball player was supposed to be and how a clubhouse was supposed to function. He had been on the receiving end of enough unfair treatment during his own career to understand how damaging public criticism could be. And yet, decades removed from the game, those same standards produced a public statement that dismissed an excellent young player based on cultural assumptions the history of the sport had already disproven many times over. The analytical mind that helped Schmidt survive Bob Gibson, outlast Larry Bowa, and win 3 MVP awards had a blind spot. And that blind spot was significant enough that it required a same-day public apology. Mike Schmidt is still one of the greatest players in baseball history. Full stop. 3 MVP awards, 10 Gold Gloves, the 1980 World Series championship, an 18-year career with one organization. That record stands completely on its own, and nothing on this list takes any of it away. But greatness on the field does not mean ease off it. Schmidt's 9 feuds tell a consistent story from beginning to end. He was a cerebral, highly sensitive man who competed in an era that valued loudness and aggression above almost everything else. When his standards and his temperament clashed with someone else's approach, the friction was real. Sometimes it cost him personally, sometimes it cost the team. And sometimes, as in 2017, it cost him something harder to measure than a batting average or a postseason result. Being a legend does not automatically mean being easy to live with. It does not mean being right about everything. And it does not protect you from your own blind spots, no matter how many trophies are sitting on the shelf. Mike Schmidt proved all of that as clearly as he proved anything that ever happened between the white lines. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and tell us which feud surprised you the most. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We will see you in the next one.